Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we sift through, well, just mountains of information, articles, books, research, you name it, to pull out the most vital, most interesting pieces of insight for you.
Yeah, the goal is really to give you that shortcut, right? To get you properly informed, maybe with a few surprising details, and hopefully keep it engaging along the way.
And today, we are plunging headfirst into a case that just completely gripped the nation. A legal saga that played out live on TV, and everyone knows it as the trial of the century.
We were talking, of course, about the people of the state of California v. Orenthal James Simpson.
O.J. Simpson. It's a case that still echoes, decades later. It really reshaped how we talk about justice, fame, the media, just so many things.
Absolutely. And our deep dive today, it's built entirely on this huge pile of sources you've given us. It lets us really unpack the layers, and believe me, there are layers to this incredibly complex case.
So our mission for you is pretty straightforward. We want to boil down the facts, help you understand the really quite groundbreaking strategies from both sides, the prosecution and the defense.
And explore that huge societal impact. This case really did define an era in many ways.
We'll dig up some surprising details, connect the dots, and try to figure out why this specific trial burned itself so deeply into the collective American memory. So, yeah, get ready.
We're about to go deep, really deep into one of the most talked about, most watched criminal trials, well, ever.
Okay, so let's rewind. Back to the very beginning, the genesis of this whole thing. What were those initial events that just catapulted this case into the spotlight, even before the lawyers really got going?
It all kicked off with, frankly, an unthinkable crime. June 12th, 1994. That Sunday evening, the bodies of Nicole Brown Simpson, O.J.'s ex-wife, and her friend Ronald Goldman were found.
Found where?
Outside Nicole's condo in Brentwood, Los Angeles. Brutally stabbed to death. The scene itself was incredibly gruesome, just a truly horrific sight.
And the focus immediately shifted.
Immediately, almost instantly, the investigation zeroed in on Orenthal James Simpson, O.J. And you have to remember who he was, not just the ex-husband.
No, he was huge. A Heisman winner, NFL legend.
Actor, commentator, a genuinely beloved figure in American culture. So his status, that public persona, it made the initial shock, the disbelief that he could be involved, just immense. It resonated across the entire country.
And if the crime itself wasn't enough to grab global attention, what happened just 5 days later, that was pure spectacle.
Oh, absolutely. June 17th, 1994, the white Ford Bronco chase. It's iconic.
Simpson was meant to surrender, right? He'd agreed to turn himself in.
He had, but he didn't show up at the agreed time. He essentially became a fugitive.
And then the chase.
What unfolded next was, well, honestly, one of the most surreal live TV events in history. It set a completely new precedent for how we consume major news. A low-speed police pursuit, Simpson in that white Bronco, driven by his friend Al Cowlings.
On the LA freeways.
Yeah, and the craziest part, TV stations actually interrupted Game 5 of the 1994 NBA Finals.
The finals. Rockets versus Knicks. They just cut away.
Cut away. Broadcast the chase live, uninterrupted, for hours.
It's hard to imagine that now without a massive uproar, but back then...
Back then, the nation was absolutely glued. Think about it. The NBA Finals interrupted. And it wasn't just a few people watching.
No, the numbers were huge.
Around 95 million people watched that chase. 95 million, you had people lining the overpasses, roads clearing. It was nuts.
It instantly turned a horrific crime into this national obsession. It became one of the most widely publicized events ever, almost up there with, the moon landing or something.
Yeah, that image of the white Bronco just slowly moving down the freeway, police cars trailing, it's seared into the memory of the 90s. It signaled right away, this is not your average criminal case.
And that massive, unprecedented public attention, it definitely set the tone for everything that came next, didn't it?
Undeniably.
Mm-hmm.
So in the days right after the chase, the legal wheels started turning fast. Simpson was formally arraigned on June 20th.
And his plea.
Absolutely, 100% not guilty. That phrase echoed through the whole trial. He was held without bail.
And the legal system immediately had to deal with this insane level of media focus.
Right, which started impacting the process straight away. A grand jury was initially convened June 21st.
But it didn't last long.
Nope. Dismissed just 2 days later, June 23rd. The reason? Concerns that the excessive media coverage could taint its impartiality.
So what did they do instead?
They opted for a probable cause hearing to determine if there was actually enough evidence to take him to trial, bypassing the potentially biased grand jury.
And the judge ruled.
On July 7th, Judge Kathleen Kennedy Powell ruled yes. Sufficient evidence existed. The trial was going ahead.
But even before the main trial kicked off, there were some early legal battles, right? The things the defense tried to introduce that got shut down.
Exactly. And this is where you really see the media circus starting to affect the evidence itself.
Like Jill Shively, the witness who saw the Bronco.
Yeah, Jill Shively. She told the grand jury she saw a white Bronco speeding away from Bundy Drive, near the scene, around the right time, almost hit another car. She even said she recognized Simpson's voice.
Sounds important,
But she sold her story to hard copy for $5,000.
Oh boy, credibility gone.
Instantly, prosecutors dropped her. And later, she made some other false claim against an actor, Brian Patrick Clark, which just sealed it. Her testimony was out.
A perfect example of how the media feeding frenzy was already messing with potential evidence, turning witnesses into, well, paid storytellers.
Exactly. And then there was Jose Camacho, the guy from the cutlery store.
Right, the knife purchase.
He had receipts showing Simpson bought a 12-inch stiletto knife, pretty similar to what they thought the murder weapon might be, just 6 weeks before the killings.
Did they find the knife?
They recovered it. It matched the general type. But tests showed this thin layer of oil on it. Basically, it had never been used.
So not the murder weapon,
Yeah.
but still potentially relevant.
Maybe. But, again, the media factor. Camacho also sold his story to the National Enquirer this time for $12,500.
So that evidence was out too.
Yep. Integrity compromised. You see this pattern emerging right away, don't you? Potential evidence tainted by the chase for cash and fame. It's a really troubling theme throughout this whole case.
And there was something about Rosie Grier too, the former football player.
Yeah, Rosie Grier, who was also a pastor. A jailhouse guard, Jeff Stewart, testified he overheard Simpson yelling to Grier during a visit, something like, "Didn't mean to do it."
Wow, but inadmissible.
Inadmissible. Judge Ito ruled it fell under clergy penitent privilege.
Mm.
That conversation was protected.
Okay. And what about the defense's early theories? They tried to float something about drug dealers, right?
They did. The drug killer theory, they called it. They wanted to suggest that maybe hitmen hired by drug dealers killed Brown and Goldman.
Why? Who were they supposedly after?
They claimed the hitmen were actually looking for Nicole's friend, Faye Resnick. She was known to use cocaine, had been staying at Nicole's condo, and the defense alleged she owed drug dealers money.
How did the judge react to that?
Judge Ito shot it down, called it highly speculative. There just wasn't any credible evidence to back it up. So he barred the jury from hearing anything about it.
So right from the start, certain defense angles, especially the more conspiracy-minded ones without solid proof, were already being closed off.
Exactly. Kind of forced their hand towards focusing more on the evidence itself, or rather, casting doubt on the evidence the prosecution had.
Okay, so the legal stuff is heating up, but this case just exploded way beyond the courtroom, didn't it? It wasn't just a crime story.
Oh, not at all. It became a phenomenon instantly. Like a producer for NBC's Today Show called it the biggest story I have ever seen.
And people were trying to cash in immediately.
Literally hours after the bodies were found, there were proposals flying around for instant books set to publish just weeks later. That shows you the immediate commercial frenzy around this tragedy.
It really was a landmark moment for reality TV, wasn't it? It kind of paved the way for a lot of what we see now.
Absolutely. The trial arguably helped revive genres like court shows. Think Judge Judy, Judge Joe Brown. Their popularity got a huge boost from the public's fascination with the Simpson trial.
And the sheer amount of coverage was just relentless.
Staggering. The Los Angeles Times ran front-page stories on the case for over 300 days after the murders. 300 days.
That's almost a year.
And compare it to other huge news events happening then. The big three networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, their nightly news broadcasts gave more airtime to the Simpson case than they did to the Bosnian War and the Oklahoma City bombing combined.
That's unbelievable. It completely warped the news cycle.
It did. And people weren't just watching passively. They were obsessed. One company estimated the hit to national productivity, from employees following the case at work, was around $40 billion.
$40 billion. That's not just watching the news. That's like a cultural black hole sucking in attention.
Totally. And the scene outside the courthouse, people described it as a total circus. Street vendors, crowds, people treating the arrivals of the lawyers like a red carpet event.
It seeped into everything, didn't it? Pop culture just absorbed it.
Oh, yeah. The Tonight Show with Jay Leno had endless skits. Remember the dancing Idos?
Vaguely. Dancers dressed like Judge Ido.
Yep. Mimicking his mannerisms. It became this weird running gag, almost like a measure of how absurd the whole thing felt.
It wasn't just America watching.
No, it went global. There's that famous story. Russian President Boris Yeltsin meets President Clinton in D.C. in '95. First question Yeltsin asks, do you think O.J. did it?
Wow. It really was the global conversation piece.
It transcended everything. It
Yeah.
became this universal symbol of, well, justice, celebrity, media, all gone wild.
But all this media frenzy wasn't without criticism, obviously. Judge Ito's decision to allow cameras in the courtroom, that was huge.
Hugely controversial. A lot of legal professionals slammed that decision. They felt it turned a serious trial into entertainment, basically.
And some involved felt the pressure, right? Alan Dershowitz from the defense team thought Ito, Clark, Darden, even Furman, and Cato Kala, they were all influenced by the cameras.
Dershowitz believed so.
Yeah.
That they were, to some extent, playing to the audience, aware of the publicity, maybe not consciously, but it affected things.
And Ito himself caught flack for letting it become a media circus.
Yeah, critics said he didn't control the proceedings enough, allowed too much grandstanding, too many distractions.
It's fascinating, too, that observation from Charles Ogletree, the Harvard law professor, that some of the best investigative reporting actually came from the National Enquirer.
Right. A tabloid known for sensationalism. Ogletree said that in 2005. It really says something about the kind of information the public was getting, doesn't it?
Oh.
Sometimes prioritizing the scoop, the sensation, over maybe more traditional journalism.
And in the middle of this media storm, you had this weird phenomenon of trial participants becoming celebrities overnight.
Totally. People who were basically unknown before.
Yeah.
Like Marcia Clark changing her hairstyle and getting a standing ovation on the courthouse steps. That's bizarre.
Just nuts. Paula Barbieri, Simpson's girlfriend at the time, she ended up in Playboy.
Leveraging the notoriety. And then there's Cato Kalin.
Oh, Cato. He became a household name for being a house guest.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The phrase was, never has a man done so little to be recognized by so many. His 4 days on the stand as a prosecution witness made him famous.
But how people saw him really varied, didn't it?
Wildly. One juror apparently called him an idiot and said his testimony was null and void for them. Just didn't find him credible at all. But Kalin himself felt completely misunderstood. He said he took it incredibly seriously, tried to answer everything perfectly. It just shows how everyone involved was thrust under this intense microscope, and their public image got shaped, maybe distorted, by the media craziness.
Okay, so the world's watching, the stage is set with all this drama. Let's pivot now. Let's get into the prosecution's actual case. They had a core argument, right?
They did. A very clear narrative. O.J. Simpson did it. They argued he was tied to the scene by a ton of forensic evidence, and his history of domestic violence provided the motive. That was the framework.
And the team they put together was pretty high-powered.
Absolutely. You had lead prosecutors Marcia Clark, who became incredibly famous, and Christopher Darden. They were assisted by Hank Goldberg and William Heisman, and crucially, they brought in top DNA experts, Rockne Harmon and George Woody Clark.
Recognizing early on how vital DNA would be.
Especially with no eyewitnesses. Their strategy was basically to build an undeniable mountain of scientific proof.
And they kicked things off by highlighting that shadow of domestic violence. That was their opening move, to frame Simpson's character.
Exactly. They started by playing Nicole Brown's 911 calls. Those were chilling. One from New Year's Day 1989, another from 1993.
And that 89 call? You could hear Simpson in the background.
Yeah, you could hear him yelling, possibly even hitting her. It was incredibly visceral, powerful stuff to play for the jury right at the start.
How did they build on that?
The police officer who responded to that 1989 call, Detective John Edwards, he testified. He described finding Nicole severely beaten, running from the bushes, screaming, "He's going to kill me, he's going to kill me," talking about Simpson.
And they showed pictures.
They showed the jury photos of Nicole's bruised face from that night. This was the incident that actually led to Simpson pleading no contest to domestic violence charges back then. The prosecution wanted to establish this pattern, this history of violence and control.
Really powerful. Then there was Ron Shipp, right? A friend of Simpson's.
Yeah, Ron Shipp, an LAPD officer, but also a longtime friend of both O.J. and Nicole. His testimony was potentially explosive.
What did he say?
He testified that the day after the murders, Simpson told him he didn't want to take a lie detector test. Shipp quoted Simpson as saying, "I've had a lot of dreams about killing her. I really don't know about taking that thing."
Wow. That sounds incredibly incriminating. How did the defense handle that?
They attacked Shipp's credibility hard, accused him of being an alcoholic, suggested he was testifying just to boost his career, get publicity, tried to paint him as unreliable.
And Nicole's sister testified too.
Denise Brown, yeah. She described multiple incidents of physical influence back in the 80s, Simpson throwing Nicole out of the house. She also said Simpson seemed agitated with Nicole on the day of the murders, June 12th, after their daughter's dance recital.
But there was conflicting evidence on that.
Kind of.
Yeah.
There was a home video from right after the recital that night showing Simpson looking cheerful. Denise even kissed him. So it presented a slightly different picture, maybe more amicable, right before things turned tragic. Even Cato Kalin said Simpson seemed upset with Nicole about a tight dress she wore that night. Another little piece suggesting tension.
Okay, so they build this picture of domestic violence, motive, and then, astonishingly, the prosecution drops that whole part of their case later on, June 1995. Why?
It was a really surprising move, and widely criticized later. Marcia Clark initially said it was because the DNA evidence was just so strong, they felt they didn't need the domestic violence angle anymore.
But was that the real reason?
Christopher Darden later admitted it was heavily influenced by comments from a dismissed juror, Jeanette Harris.
What did she say?
Harris had been dismissed earlier for not disclosing her own history as a domestic violence victim. After she was off the jury, she gave an interview saying Simpson's past abuse of Nicole doesn't mean he is guilty of murder.
So hearing that from a domestic violence victim on the jury...
It spooked the prosecution. They worried the argument wasn't landing the way they thought, wasn't convincing jurors of murder, even if it established motive. And after the verdict, other jurors basically confirmed that, calling the domestic violence testimony a waste of time.
That feels like a massive strategic blunder, especially given who the defense initially hired.
It's ironic, isn't it? The defense had initially retained Lenore E. Walker, a really famous expert on domestic abuse. Johnny Cochran even boasted she'd testify Simpson didn't fit the killer profile.
But she didn't testify.
Nope. She was abruptly dropped from their witness list for tactical reasons. Why? Because her submitted report contained a devastating statistic.
Which was?
Alan Dershowitz kept using this misleading statistic, saying only a tiny fraction of abused women are killed by their partners. Walker's report pointed out that was irrelevant because Nicole was already dead. The key question, she said, was, of the murdered spouses who were also victims of abuse, what percentage of them were murdered by their current or ex-husband?
And her answer?
80.3%. A huge number. Once that came out, the defense dropped her immediately.
So the whole situation, the prosecution dropping it, the defense experts' own damaging findings, it kind of accidentally forced the issue of domestic violence into the national spotlight.
Exactly. It transformed it from this private, hidden issue into a recognized public health crisis.
Right.
That was a lasting, maybe unexpected, positive outcome from all the tragedy. A major societal shift.
Okay, shifting from motive to opportunity, the prosecution focused heavily on the timeline, right? Simpson's alibi gap.
Yes, absolutely critical. The L.A. County Chief Medical Examiner, Dr. Lakshmanan Satyavyaswaran, estimated Nicole Brown's time of death was between 10 p.m. and 10:30 p.m. that night. That window became crucial.
And this is where Cato Kalin's testimony mattered despite credibility questions.
Right. He testified the last time he saw Simpson was at 9:36 p.m. Then we know there was a phone call from Simpson's Bronco to Paula Barbieri at 10:02 p.m.
But Simpson wasn't seen again until
10:54 p.m. That's when he finally answered the intercom for his limo driver, Alan Park.
So if the murders happened between 10:0 and 10:30, and Kalin saw him last at 9:36.
That leaves a gap. Roughly 1 hour and 18 minutes where Simpson had no alibi, and during which the prosecution argued the murders occurred. A critical, unexplained window.
And the limo driver, Park, his testimony tightened that even more.
He did. Park said he arrived at Simpson's Rockingham estate at 10:25 p.m. He noted the Bronco wasn't visible then. He drove around, rang the intercom at 10:40 p.m., no answer. Finally, Simpson answers at 10:54 p.m., claiming he'd overslept. That whole sequence made the timeline look very suspicious.
And they took the jury to the scene.
Yeah, a really unusual move. They visited the Bundy crime scene and Simpson's house at Rockingham, let the jurors walk the grounds, visualize the locations and distances. It was during that visit one juror apparently had that surreal moment, seeing the Heisman Trophy and thinking, wow, first time I've seen one of those. Just highlights that bizarre mix of celebrity and murder.
Okay, now the forensic backbone. With no eyewitnesses, the prosecution really hung their hat on the science, especially DNA.
Heavily. It was groundbreaking stuff for a trial back then. They presented 108 forensic exhibits, including 61 different drops of blood. Their goal was to use science to reconstruct the crime almost like an eyewitness saw it.
Marcia Clark talked about a trail of blood.
Yeah, she said in her opening statement there was a trail of blood from the Bundy crime scene through Simpson's Ford Bronco to his bedroom at Rockingham. And the DNA evidence they presented was, on paper, incredibly powerful.
How specific was it?
Extremely. Simpson's DNA was found in blood drops right next to the bloody footprints at the Bundy scene. The probability of it being someone else, they put it at 1 in 9.7 billion.
Basically impossible it wasn't him.
Effectively unique. His DNA was also found on blood drops leading away from the bodies, on the back gate at Bundy probability there, 1 in 200.
And in the Bronco.
Blood in the Bronco contained DNA matching Simpson, Goldman, and Brown. The probability of error cited there was 1 in 21 billion. And at his own home, on the walkway leading from where the Bronco was parked to his front door, more drops with his DNA.
What about the gloves?
The bloody glove found behind Simpson's house. The mate to the one at the crime scene had DNA from Simpson, Brown, and Goldman on it.
And the socks, that was a big one too.
The socks found in Simpson's bedroom. Bloodstains on them had DNA matching Simpson and Nicole Brown. Probability of error, 1 in 6.8 billion. The prosecution aimed for this overwhelming avalanche of scientific data.
Beyond blood, they also used hair and fiber evidence, right, to add more layers.
Yes, LAPD criminalist Susan Brockbank and FBI Special Agent Doug Diedrich testified about those findings.
What were the key takeaways there?
Pretty detailed stuff. Fibers from the glove found at Simpson's house microscopically matched the one at the crime scene, suggesting they were a pair. Hair consistent with Simpson's was found on both victims, on both gloves, and crucially, on a blue Nick cap the killer apparently wore.
Embedded deep, suggesting he wore it often.
Exactly. Embedded in the seams. Pointed directly to Simpson. They also found dark blue cotton fibers on the victims, consistent with a shirt Simpson was seen wearing earlier that night, a shirt, by the way, that was never recovered by police.
Interesting. What else?
Hair matching Goldman was found on Nicole Brown, and fibers from her clothes were on Goldman, supporting the idea he got involved in the struggle trying to help her. And that glove found at Simpson's house. It was like a forensic treasure trove.
How so?
It had a mix of hair and fibers consistent with Simpson, Brown, Goldman, fibers from a 93-94 Ford Bronco like Simpson's, and even fibers from Nicole's Akita dog, which was at the scene barking. It was this complex web-tying Simpson to everything.
And then the shoe prints. That led to the whole Bruno Magli shoe saga.
Right. FBI expert William Bodziak testified. Bloody shoe prints at the crime scene, and also inside Simpson's Bronco, were made by these very specific, expensive Italian shoes, Bruno Magli's, size 12.
Simpson size.
Simpson size. And these weren't common shoes. Only 299 pairs of that specific style and size were sold in the U.S. One pair was sold at a store in New York Simpson was known to shop at.
Did Bodziak think there was more than one attacker?
No. He testified that even though there were two sets of prints, they were all made by the same pair of shoes, indicating just one killer.
And Simpson denied owning them.
Emphatically denied ever owning those shoes. The prosecution only had circumstantial evidence he did a C. Bloomingdale's employee remembered showing them to him, but no receipt.
But they found a print in the Bronco, too.
Yes, and the defense tried to preemptively attack that, suggesting maybe Detective Mark Furman planted it. They even showed a photo of Furman walking through blood at the scene.
But Bodziak dismissed that.
He did. He pointed out none of the prints at the scene were made by Furman's shoes, so it didn't make sense that Furman would somehow track a Bruno Magli print into the Bronco. He called it highly unlikely.
Okay, so the prosecution lays out this mountain of forensic evidence. DNA, hair, fibers, shoe prints, the timeline. It seems overwhelming. How on earth did the defense fight back? This is where the Dream Team really earned their name, I guess.
Indeed. Simpson had assembled this, legal supergroup, initially led by Robert Shapiro, but then the very charismatic Johnny Cochran took over. You had legends like F. Lee Bailey, Simpson's friend Robert Kardashian, the appellate expert Alan Dershowitz,
And crucially, the DNA guys.
Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, experts from the Innocence Project. Their role became absolutely pivotal.
The media called them the Dream Team. Cost a fortune, too, right? Estimates were like $3 to $6 million.
Yeah, a staggering amount for defense back then. But sources suggest it wasn't all smooth sailing internally. There were reports of ego clashes, lawyers vying for the spotlight.
So what was their main strategy against all that evidence?
Simple in concept. Attack the evidence itself. Argue it was unreliable, compromised, contaminated. And Scheck and Neufeld led that charge, focusing on the DNA.
How did they argue it was contaminated?
They pointed to what they called sloppy police work at the crime scene. They got LAPD criminalists Dennis Fung and Andrea Mazzola to admit to several procedural errors during evidence collection.
Like what specifically? What mistakes did the defense seize on?
Things like not always changing gloves between handling different pieces of evidence, raising the risk of cross-contamination, using plastic bags instead of paper for storing some evidence, plastic traps moisture, which can degrade DNA.
And leaving evidence in a hot van.
Exactly. storing samples in an unrefrigerated police van for up to 7 hours. The defense hammered on this, arguing these mistakes allowed bacteria to potentially degrade the DNA, making the samples vulnerable to cross-contamination later in the LAPD crime lab. Basically, they argued you couldn't trust the results.
And they brought in their own expert.
Microbiologist John Gertis. He testified that the type of DNA testing used PCR, which amplifies tiny amounts of DNA, was unreliable, especially back then. He claimed the LAPD lab had a chronic substantial contamination problem.
He even claimed some samples were planted.
Yeah, he sensationally argued that only 3 of the DNA matches were valid, and wouldn't you know it, those are the exact 3 samples the defense was claiming the police had planted.
That's a huge accusation. How did the prosecution push back during cross-examination?
They pushed back hard. They got Gertis to admit he had no proof that actual cross-contamination did occur in this case. He was just talking about possibilities, what might occur.
Not what did occur.
Right. He also had to concede that the victim's blood was in the Bronco and Simpson's blood was at the crime scene, and those weren't due to contamination. Crucial points. He also admitted packaging didn't affect the results from the independent labs they sent samples to.
And they went after his credibility?
Oh, yeah. Pointed out he had no real forensic experience, always testified for defendants claiming contamination, and how convenient it was that the only valid samples were the ones claimed to be planted. Even the defense's own other expert, the famous Henry Lee, called Gertis's contamination claim highly improbable.
Then there was the EDTA issue, the planted blood theory. This was about preservative in police blood vials, right?
Exactly. The defense claimed 2 key blood samples, the one on the back gate matching Simpson and the one on the socks matching Nicole, had EDTA in them, a preservative used in police reference files. The implication? The blood was taken from Simpson's vial and planted.
But didn't the prosecution ask for those tests?
Ironically, yes. They were confident it wasn't planted, so they initiated the testing, but it kind of backfired, initially at least. The defense expert, Frederick Raiders, first testified that yes, high EDTA levels supported the planting theory. But then Marcia Clark cross-examined him.
And?
It fell apart. Clark showed Raiders had completely misread an EPA document about normal EDTA levels in blood. He tried to claim it was a typo in the document, but the prosecution produced the actual EPA source, proving him wrong.
So the levels found were actually normal.
Consistent with unpreserved blood, not blood from a preserved vial. Raiders also had to admit EDTA is found in everyday things, like, say, a Big Mac and fries, which Simpson ate that night, providing a perfectly innocent explanation.
And the FBI expert contradicted him, too.
Completely. FBI agent Roger Martz, who actually did the tests the defense relied on, testifies he did not identify EDTA definitively. He said an initial screening test was consistent with EDTA, but the follow-up confirmation test was inconclusive. He even tested his own unpreserved blood and found similar levels, stating it conclusively disproved the idea the blood came from police vials. That was a major hit to the planting theory.
Okay, so the defense is attacking the science, but then comes the element that arguably changed everything. Detective Mark Furman.
Ah, Furman. The detective who found the bloody glove at Simpson's house and the blood spot on the Bronco. He became central and ultimately devastating for the prosecution.
It started with that cross-examination by F. Lee Bailey, right, about racist language.
Exactly. Bailey asked Furman point blank if he'd used the N-word to describe African Americans in the previous 10 years. Furman denied it, unequivocally. Said anyone claiming he did would be a liar.
A huge gamble by the defense. That paid off.
Massively. A few months later, the Furman tapes surfaced.
Tapes from a screenwriter.
Laura Hart McKinney. She had recorded interviews with Furman years earlier for a project. On those takes, Furman repeatedly used the N-word, other slurs, talked about police misconduct, directly contradicting his sworn testimony.
How did the prosecution react?
Marcia Clark tried to downplay it, called the tapes the biggest red herring. But the damage was immense. Judge Ado eventually allowed the jury to hear just 2 short but deeply disturbing excerpts.
And Clark saw the impact immediately.
She later described watching the jury's reaction as her moment of horror and disgust. She basically felt the case was lost right then. This wasn't just about one detective anymore. It injected the explosive issue of race and potential police conspiracy right into the heart of the trial. It shifted everything.
It became about more than just Simpson's guilt or innocence.
It became about the integrity of the LAPD, about systemic racism, about whether the jury could trust any evidence handled by these officers. It forced this huge national conversation.
And when Furman was called back to the stand after the tapes emerged?
That was another massive moment. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination.
Specifically when asked about planting evidence.
Yes. When asked directly, did you plant or manufacture any evidence in this case?
Yeah.
He pleaded the Fifth, refused to answer.
Which everyone interpreted
As him basically admitting he'd perjured himself about the racism and maybe, just maybe, about planting evidence too. Legally, pleading the Fifth isn't an admission of guilt, but the implication was incredibly powerful for the jury.
And Johnny Cochran ran with it?
Absolutely weaponized it. He accused other officers of conspiring to protect Furman. He asked Ito to throw out all the evidence Furman touched. Ito refused, saying there was no proof of a wider conspiracy.
But Cochran's closing argument?
That's where he went all in. He compared Furman to Hitler, called him the personification of evil, explicitly accused him of planting the glove because he hated interracial couples, accused Detective Van Natter of planting Simpson's blood too, called them the two devils of deception.
And urged the jury to send a message.
Yes, he told them to stop this cover-up and acquit Simpson and send the police a message. It was widely seen as a direct appeal for jury nullification and ignore the evidence, acquit to punish the police.
That caused a huge backlash, didn't it?
Oh yeah. Fred Goldman, Ron's father, publicly called Cochran a racist and a sick man. The rhetoric was incredibly inflammatory.
And amidst all this, we get the single most iconic image of the trial. The glove demonstration.
The glove doesn't fit. Moment. June 15th, 1995. Christopher Darden made the call, apparently surprising even Marcia Clark, to ask Simpson to try on the leather gloves.
Why was Clark surprised?
Because they knew the gloves had been soaked in blood, frozen, unfrozen. They likely wouldn't fit properly anymore. It was a huge risk by Darden, apparently impulsive.
And the scene in the courtroom?
It was pure theater. Simpson struggled visibly to pull the gloves on, especially the latex ones he wore underneath, grimacing, straining for the jury.
Clark thought he was faking it.
She claimed he was acting. But then Cochran delivered that killer line. I don't think he could act the size of his hands. Instantly iconic. The image stuck.
Darden admitted it didn't go well.
Yeah, he later said it hadn't gone as well as I hoped. He raised concerns about Simpson's arthritis, claimed he hadn't taken his medication, though jail records apparently disproved that.
What was the prosecution's explanation for why they didn't fit?
That they shrank. They brought in Richard Rubin from Aris Isotoner, the glove maker. He testified leather gloves do shrink up to 15% when soaked and dried, and they don't regain their size. Darden even showed a new, identical pair that did fit Simpson.
But the damage was done.
The visual of Simpson struggling with the original evidence glove was incredibly powerful, even if jurors understood intellectually that gloves shrink. Like juror David Aldana later said, I wear gloves all the time. I know that when my gloves get wet, they shrink up. The image itself was a huge symbolic win for the defense. It just perfectly encapsulated their narrative of things not adding up.
So after 8 long months, 92 days of testimony, and nearly 500 exhibits, the trial finally reached its conclusion. Closing arguments, then the verdict everyone was waiting for.
Yeah, it was intense. Marcia Clark gave her final plea. She had to acknowledge Furman's racism, his lies. She said, yes, he is a racist, but the fact that Mark Furman is a racist and lied does not mean that we haven't proven the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah.
She tried desperately to pull the focus back to the science.
But the defense hammered Furman one last time.
Barry Steck did. Called Furman a genocidal racist, focused on the allegedly contaminated sock evidence, and argued it created reasonable doubt. Period. End of sentence. End of case.
And then Cochran's final, unforgettable line.
If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. Simple, memorable, powerful. It captured their entire defense in one sentence.
And the jury deliberation was surprisingly fast, wasn't it?
Shockingly fast. After being sequestered, basically locked away from the world, for 9 months, they reached a verdict very quickly.
How did the vote go initially?
The first vote was apparently 10 not guilty, 2 guilty, but those 2 quickly changed their minds. It became unanimous. Not guilty.
Juror David Aldana said something interesting about why those last 2 changed.
Yeah, he said they weren't convinced Simpson was innocent, but rather that the prosecution simply hadn't met its burden, hadn't proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. As he put it, the prosecution just didn't prove it.
After the verdict, the jurors started talking and their perspectives were all over the place. Really gave a glimpse into that room.
Absolutely. Juror Carrie Bess made that famous statement. She believed 90% of the jury actually decided to acquit Simpson as payback for Rodney King. A really stark comment on the racial dynamics.
Then you had Lionel Cryer, the juror who gave Simpson the Black Power salute. He later changed his mind.
Yeah, in a 2017 interview, he said, looking back, he would vote guilty. A significant shift.
And Anise Aschenbach, who initially voted guilty.
She flipped during deliberations, but later said she deeply regretted it. By 2008, she believed Simpson was guilty, mainly because he never followed through on his promise to find the real killer.
David Aldana stuck to his guns about the evidence being tainted.
He did. On the evidence, it was crooked by the cops. I could not convict. Did he do it? Maybe, maybe not. He was convinced Furman planted evidence, said everything that he had anything to do with, pretty much got thrown out. Shows Furman's impact on him.
Juror Sheila Woods denied it was about race for her.
Right. She thought Simpson might know something, but didn't think he actually did it. Her reasoning: lack of blood on him from such a bloody scene, Goldman's defensive wounds versus Simpson's small cut. She questioned how he could leave clean, noting his snow-white carpet.
Yolanda Adams also stood by the verdict.
Yeah. Still comfortable with not guilty, denied it was payback, cited reasonable doubt, specifically mentioning Furman taking the fifth. Just shows how differently each juror weighed the evidence and the doubts raised.
And these juror comments immediately reflected that massive racial split in public opinion we saw right after the verdict.
Stark difference. Polls showed something like 75% of white Americans thought he was guilty, while 70% of black Americans thought he was innocent. A huge divide.
Did that gap ever close?
It narrowed over time. By the 2010s, polls showed majorities in both groups believed he was guilty, around 83% of white Americans, 57% of black Americans. Perceptions definitely shifted as more came out.
There was also that complex discussion about police fraud versus racial motivation. Simpson felt vindicated by later LAPD scandals like Rampart.
Right, but our sources point out the Rampart scandal, while showing massive corruption, wasn't primarily racially motivated in the way the defense implied Furman was. Those corrupt officers were mostly minorities themselves. It was more about power and greed within that specific unit, though it fed the general narrative of police misconduct.
People even compared it years later to cases like Trayvon Martin's.
Yeah, Kim Goldman, Ron's sister, pushed back on that comparison. She argued the Simpson case had overwhelming evidence pointing to guilt, whereas she saw the Zimmerman-Trayvon Martin case as self-defense, not racial. Fred Goldman agreed. Denying racism was the key factor in either case.
Okay, so acquittal in the criminal trial, but then came the civil trial in 1997, a completely different beast.
Totally different. This was a wrongful death suit brought by the victims' families, Fred Goldman, Sharon Rufo, Ron's mother, and Lou Brown, Nicole's father. And the rules were different.
How so? What were the key changes?
Judge Hiroshi Fujisaki made some crucial rulings. No TV cameras allowed, so no media circus this time. The jury wasn't sequestered, they lived normal lives. And critically, the defense was barred from playing the race card, no alleging LAPD racism, no attacking the crime lab like before. Furman was basically off the table as a defense strategy.
And the biggest difference? The burden of proof.
Huge difference. Criminal trial needed proof beyond a reasonable doubt, near certainty. Civil trial only required a preponderance of the evidence, meaning was it more likely than not that Simpson was responsible? Much lower bar.
And there was new evidence, too, the shoes.
Yes, this was massive. The plaintiffs produced 31 photos of Simpson wearing Bruno Magli's shoes taken before the murders, some published months earlier. Completely demolished his denial, and the defense's claim the earlier photos were forged.
Nicole's diary entries also played a role, exploring motive again.
They did. The plaintiff's lawyer, Daniel Petruccelli, used them, along with other details, to argue the murders were the climax of years of domestic abuse. He pointed to immediate triggers, IRS issues, Nicole limiting access to the kids, treating him like a stranger, arguing it led to weeks of simmering rage and retaliation that culminated in the killings.
And the verdict in the civil trial?
Unanimous. The jury found Simpson responsible for both deaths, awarded $34 million in damages, though, as our sources note, the families have received very little of that money, even by 2024, due to Simpson's financial situation and maneuvering.
The trial also launched 1,000 books, didn't it? Everyone involved seemed to write one.
Pretty much an entire cottage industry. You had the juror's book, Madam Foreman, saying probably guilty, but not proven. Marcia Clark's Without a Doubt, arguing the system failed due to race and celebrity. Darden's In Contempt, blaming Ito and the jury.
Vincent Bugliosi's outrage was pretty scathing.
Called it the most obvious case of guilt he had ever seen, blamed everyone, jury, prosecution, judge. Even Henry Lee, the defense's own expert, conceded in his book Blood Evidence that Scheck and Neufeld ultimately rejected Scheck's initial contamination claims internally. That's telling.
Furman wrote one defending himself.
Murder in Brentwood, yeah. Claimed he took the Fifth only to avoid perjury charges for his past racist remarks, not because he planted anything. Detectives Lange and Van Otter wrote evidence dismissed to defend their investigation against incompetence claims.
Petruccelli, the civil lawyer, wrote Triumph of Justice,
Comparing the trials, blaming the criminal acquittal on bad rulings and defense tactics. And sociologist Darnell Hunt argued in O.J. Simpson Facts and Fictions that the media manufactured the racial polling gap by treating it all as entertainment.
And Simpson himself kept adding fuel to the fire with weird statements afterwards.
Oh, yeah. That Esquire quote from '98. Let's say I committed this crime. Even if I did this, it would have to have been because I loved her very much, right? Chilling stuff.
And the banana incident.
With Ruby Wax, the British comedian. Pretending to stab her with a banana as a joke. Just incredibly tasteless. And Mike Gilbert's book quoted Simpson allegedly saying, if she hadn't opened that door with a knife in her hand, she'd still be alive. These things just kept the controversy boiling.
The case also generated all sorts of alternate theories, didn't it? Keeping the mystery alive for some.
Definitely. Theories about accomplices, or a total frame-up by police, connections to the L.A. drug trade, linking it to other unsolved murders, something the defense tried early on.
And the theory about his son, Jason?
That gained some traction, pointing to things like Simpson supposedly hiring lawyers for his kids first, photos of Jason in a similar knit cap, an alleged plan for Jason to meet Nicole that night. These alternative narratives persist for people who just don't buy the official story.
And the trial's pop culture footprint is just immense. It never really went away.
Never. Countless movies and TV shows. The O.J. Simpson story right away in '95, American Tragedy in 2000, then the huge resurgence in 2016 with The People v. O.J. Simpson, American Crime Story, and the Oscar-winning documentary O.J. Made in America.
And there's another one coming.
The Juice, apparently exploring conspiracy theories, set for 2025. These adaptations keep re-examining it, bringing it to new generations, sparking new debates.
And the references go way beyond direct adaptation.
Oh, yeah. WrestleMania 12. Roddy Piper chasing Goldust in a white Bronco, using footage from the actual chase. Apparently, the original plan was for Simpson himself to wrestle Piper, but they backed down due to backlash fears.
Unbelievable.
Video games like Duke Nukem, songs by Good Charlotte, Eminem, and the actual Bronco. It turned up on Pawn Stars. It wasn't just a trial. It became this permanent fixture in the cultural landscape. Still referenced, still debated, still fascinating.
So wrapping up this really deep dive into the O.J. Simpson trial, what's the big takeaway? It really feels like this core tension, doesn't it? Overwhelming science versus a defense that masterfully sowed doubt.
Exactly. Doubt about police conduct, doubt fueled by racial tensions. It just ripped the cover off these deep societal divisions, especially around race and justice.
And it completely changed the game for how we see celebrity, media coverage, turning a legal case into this global reality show.
Which is why diving back into it now is still so relevant. It's not just looking back at history.
Oh, it genuinely shaped things we grapple with today. How we talk about domestic violence that changed significantly because of this.
The role of forensic science, especially DNA in courtrooms, that exploded after this trial.
How the media covers huge cases, the 2004-7 saturation, the celebrity aspect, that was cemented here.
And those really tough, ongoing conversations about race, police, and the justice system, this trial put them front and center in a way few things had before. And they're still incredibly relevant conversations.
So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. You have these two trials, criminal and civil, with completely opposite outcomes based on largely the same core events.
Right. So what does the O.J. Simpson saga ultimately tell us about finding truth in a courtroom? About what justice even looks like when it's under this intense media glare, tangled up with fame, race, and doubt?
It's a question with no easy answer, isn't it? It challenges our assumptions about the legal system, about evidence, about ourselves.
And maybe it always will. It's a case that just continues to resonate and probably always will.